The words hit Alessandro like a bullet to the chest.
I love you too.
Natalia's voice drifted across their shared office, soft and tender in a way that made Alessandro's blood turn to ice. He sat motionless at his desk, the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, casting her silhouette in golden light as she spoke into her phone. Hit the subscribe button and comments where you're watching from. Their office had always been intimate by design. Alessandro preferred having his most trusted employee close, where he could monitor every call, every visitor, every breath. Natalia's desk sat perpendicular to his, close enough that he could reach out and touch her shoulder if he wanted, close enough to hear every whispered conversation, close enough to have his heart ripped from his chest by 4 simple words. "Gabriel, you know I can't talk long," she continued, her voice dropping to that honeyed whisper she'd never once used with him. "But yes, tonight, I've been counting the minutes." Alessandro's pen froze mid-signature on the contract spread before him. Gabriel. The name burned through his mind like acid, erasing every rational thought. In 3 years of working side by side, sharing this space, breathing the same air, Natalia had never mentioned anyone named Gabriel. She laughed then, a sound like silver bells that made Alessandro's chest constrict with something he refused to name. Her free hand played with the pearl necklace at her throat, fingers dancing over the smooth surface in a gesture so unconsciously sensual it made his mouth go dry. "Stop being silly," she murmured into the phone. "Of course I mean it. You know exactly how I feel about you." The contract crumpled beneath Alessandro's clenched fist. For 3 years, he'd told himself that the way his pulse raced when she entered the room each morning meant nothing, that the protective fury that consumed him whenever other men looked at her was simply professional concern, that the dreams where she looked at him with something warmer than polite efficiency were just his imagination running wild. But watching her now, seeing the way love transformed her entire being, Alessandro finally understood the truth that had been growing in the shadows of his heart like a cancer. He was desperately, completely in love with Natalia Rossi, and she was in love with someone else. I know, she said, glancing briefly in his direction before turning back to the window. He's right here, but he's buried in paperwork. He never pays attention to my personal calls anyway. The casual dismissal cut deeper than any knife. To Natalia, he was invisible, a piece of furniture in their shared space, no more worthy of consideration than the leather chairs or marble floors. She could declare her love for another man 10 feet away from him, because in her mind, Alessandro Torino simply didn't exist as anything more than her employer. "Tonight will be perfect," she whispered, her voice thick with promise. "I can't wait to show you how much you mean to me." Alessandro's vision blurred red around the edges. Every instinct honed by years of violence and control screamed at him to act, to take, to destroy whatever stood between him and what he wanted. He'd built an empire on the simple principle that Alessandro Torino took what belonged to him. But this was different. This was Natalia, who brought him coffee exactly how he liked it without being asked, who anticipated his needs before he voiced them, who somehow became the axis around which his entire world revolved. This was the woman he loved, planning a romantic evening with another man while he sat close enough to touch her. "I have to go," she said finally. "But Gabriel, I love you. More than you know." She ended the call and immediately returned to her work, fingers flying across her keyboard as if the conversation that had just destroyed Alessandro's world was nothing more than a brief interruption to her day. Alessandro stared at his hands, knuckles white where they gripped the ruined contract. The rational part of his mind whispered warnings about boundaries, about the dangerous territory his thoughts were entering. But rationality had no power over the storm building in his chest. Natalia belonged to someone named Gabriel. That was about to change, whether she wanted it to or not. 3 years earlier, Natalia Rossi had walked into Alessandro's life wearing a navy blue dress and desperation. She'd answered his advertisement for a personal assistant with trembling hands and a resume that barely filled half a page. Fresh out of college, drowning in her father's medical bills, she'd been willing to work for anyone who could pay her enough to keep the creditors at bay, even a man whose reputation whispered of shadows and violence. "Miss Rossi," Alessandro had said that first day, not bothering to look up from his desk as she entered his office. "You understand the nature of this position requires absolute discretion." "Yes, sir." Her voice had been steady, despite the fear he could smell on her like perfume. He'd finally raised his eyes then, and something had shifted in his chest. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. There was an intelligence in her dark eyes, a quiet strength in the way she held herself despite her obvious nervousness. She didn't flinch when their gazes met, didn't look away like so many others did. "The hours are long, the work is demanding, and you will see and hear things that must never leave this room. I understand." "Do you?" He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Because the last 3 assistants quit within a month. One moved to another state, another changed her name." Natalia had lifted her chin slightly, and Alessandro had seen something flicker in her expression. Not defiance exactly, but determination. "I need this job, Mr. Torino. My father is sick and I have nowhere else to go. Whatever you need from me, I can handle it." That was the beginning. For the first 6 months, their relationship had been purely professional. Natalia arrived each morning at exactly 8 o'clock, coffee in hand, ready to organize his chaotic world with ruthless efficiency. She scheduled his meetings, filtered his calls, and somehow managed to make sense of the deliberately confusing web of his business dealings. She never asked questions about the men who visited his office at odd hours, their voices low and urgent, never commented on the phone calls that ended with thinly veiled threats, never flinched when she had to clean blood from his knuckles after particularly difficult negotiations. But Alessandro noticed everything about her. The way she bit her lower lip when concentrating on difficult tasks, how she hummed softly under her breath while organizing files, melodies he'd never heard but found himself listening for each morning. The small smile that played at the corners of her mouth when she thought no one was watching. He noticed when she started skipping lunch to save money and began having meals delivered to the office for meetings that never materialized. He noticed when her father's condition worsened and quietly arranged for the best specialists in the city to take over his care. He noticed when her ancient car broke down and ensured she found a reliable replacement at a price she could somehow afford. Natalia never knew about any of it. To her, Alessandro remained exactly what he'd always been, her employer. Demanding but fair, cold but never cruel. She thanked him for his generosity when he gave her raises, never suspecting they were far beyond what any assistant should earn. She accepted his explanations about company insurance covering her father's medical bills, never questioning how a man who officially ran import businesses could have such comprehensive healthcare benefits. She trusted him completely, and that trust became Alessandro's greatest treasure and his deepest torment. Because somewhere between her first nervous smile and her 1,000th perfectly brewed cup of coffee, Alessandro Torino had fallen in love. It happened so gradually he didn't recognize it at first. The way his mood improved when she walked into the office each morning, how he found excuses to keep her working late just to have her presence fill the empty spaces of his world a little longer. The protective rage that consumed him when other men looked at her with interest. By the end of her first year, Alessandro knew he was lost. By the end of her second year, he'd accepted that she would never see him as anything more than her boss. By the end of her third year, he'd convinced himself that having her close was enough. That watching her smile, hearing her laugh at his rare attempts at humor, feeling her presence in his daily life was all he needed. Until today. Until Gabriel. until Alessandro realized that all this time, while he'd been falling deeper in love with a woman who saw him as nothing more than a paycheck, she'd been building a life that didn't include him at all. The realization burned through him like poison, transforming 3 years of careful restraint into something far more dangerous. 6 months before the phone call that would change everything, Alessandro noticed Natalia had started wearing perfume. It was subtle at first, a hint of jasmine and vanilla that lingered in the air after she passed his desk, but Alessandro's senses were trained to detect the smallest changes in his environment, and this shift in Natalia's routine set off alarm bells he couldn't ignore. She'd also started leaving the office for lunch. For 2.5 years, Natalia had eaten at her desk, usually a simple sandwich or salad she'd brought from home, but suddenly she was gathering her purse at noon, offering polite excuses about errands and appointments, returning an hour later with a glow in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Going out again?" Alessandro asked one Thursday afternoon as she reached for her coat. "Just meeting a friend," she replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "I'll be back by 1. Friend. The words sat heavy in Alessandro's chest as he watched her disappear into the elevator. In 3 years, Natalia had never mentioned friends. Her life seemed to revolve entirely around work and caring for her father. The idea that she had a social life he knew nothing about felt like a betrayal he had no right to claim. But Alessandro Torino hadn't built an empire by ignoring his instincts. That afternoon, he made a call. "Follow her," he told Marco, one of his most trusted men. "Discreetly. I want to know where she goes, who she sees, what she does." The report came back within hours, and it changed everything. Natalia was meeting a man, Gabriel Martinez, 30 years old, owner of a small but successful consulting firm. Clean record, no criminal connections, no obvious red flags. They'd met at a coffee shop near her father's hospital, struck up a conversation in the waiting room while her father underwent treatment. Alessandro stared at the photographs Marco had taken, Natalia sitting across from Gabriel at a small cafe table, her face animated in a way Alessandro had never seen. Gabriel leaning forward, hanging on her every word, his expression soft with obvious attraction. In one photo, Gabrielle was reaching across the table to touch Natalia's hand. In another, she was laughing at something he'd said, her head thrown back with genuine joy. Alessandro had seen Natalia smile thousands of times over the years. Professional smiles, polite smiles, the occasional amused smile when he made a rare joke. But this was different. This was radiant happiness, the kind that came from being truly seen and appreciated. The kind of happiness Alessandro had dreamed of inspiring in her, but never had. "Keep watching," he ordered Marco. "I want weekly reports." The reports became a form of torture. Every week brought new details about Natalia's blossoming relationship. Dinner dates at quiet restaurants, walks through the park, a weekend trip to the coast that made Alessandro's hands shake with rage he couldn't express. Gabriel Martinez had no idea what kind of man he was competing with, but he was about to find out. The first blow came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with surgical precision. Gabriel Martinez arrived at his consulting office to find his biggest client waiting in the lobby, their face grim with the kind of expression that meant only one thing. The Hartwell Corporation contract, worth 6 figures and representing 40% of Gabriel's annual income, was being terminated immediately. "I'm sorry, Gabriel," Patricia Hartwell said, her voice strained. "We've received some concerning information about your business practices. We can't afford to be associated with any potential irregularities." Gabriel stared at her in confusion. "What irregularities? Patricia, we've worked together for 3 years. You know my reputation." "Anonymous tips came in yesterday. Financial improprieties, questions about your licensing, suggestions that you've been cutting corners on compliance issues." She wouldn't meet his eyes. "We have to protect our company's image." The accusations were baseless, but Gabriel knew that in the business world, perception mattered more than truth. By noon, word had spread through his professional network like wildfire. 3 smaller clients called to cancel their contracts. 2 potential new deals evaporated without explanation. Gabriel spent the rest of the week fighting fires that seemed to ignite faster than he could extinguish them. Every time he thought he'd contained the damage, another crisis emerged. His business license was flagged for routine review that would take months to resolve. His office lease was suddenly under scrutiny for zoning violations that never existed before. Meanwhile, 20 floors above the chaos consuming Gabriel's life, Alessandro sat in his office watching Natalia's growing distress with cold satisfaction. She'd started taking more personal calls, her voice tight with worry as she tried to comfort Gabriel through each new disaster. Alessandro could hear fragments of their conversations, could see the way her hands trembled as she offered reassurances she clearly didn't believe herself. "It's just bad luck," she whispered into her phone during one particularly difficult afternoon. "These things happen in business. You'll get through this." But Alessandro could see the doubt creeping into her eyes, the way she glanced at her phone anxiously when Gabriel didn't respond to her messages immediately, the forced brightness in her voice when she tried to maintain optimism in the face of mounting evidence that Gabriel's professional life was crumbling. The second wave of attacks came 2 weeks later. Gabriel's car was vandalized in his apartment parking garage, windows smashed, tires slashed, the word fraud spray-painted across the hood. The police report disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. His insurance claim was delayed indefinitely due to suspicious circumstances. His credit cards were mysteriously maxed out by fraudulent charges that would take months to dispute. His bank accounts were frozen pending investigation of unusual activity patterns that existed only in fabricated reports. Alessandro had learned long ago that destroying a man didn't require violence, it required patience, precision, and the kind of connections that could turn legitimate institutions into weapons. Gabriel Martinez was drowning in a sea of manufactured problems, and every stroke he took to stay afloat only pulled him deeper under the surface. "He's thinking about leaving the city," Natalia confided to someone during a phone call Alessandro pretended not to hear. "Starting over somewhere else. He says it feels like the whole world is against him." The pain in her voice should have given Alessandro pause, should have reminded him that destroying Gabriel meant hurting the woman he claimed to love. But the possessive darkness that had taken root in his chest fed on her distress, twisted it into proof that Gabriel wasn't strong enough to protect her. A real man would fight back. A real man would find a way to overcome these obstacles. A real man wouldn't run away and abandon the woman he supposedly loved. Alessandro had faced down rival families, corrupt politicians, and federal investigations. He'd built an empire from nothing and defended it against enemies who would have killed him without hesitation. Gabriel Martinez couldn't even handle a few business setbacks. The third wave would be the final one. Alessandro had saved the most devastating blow for last, the one that would drive Gabriel from the city permanently and leave Natalia with nowhere to turn except to the man who loved her enough to become a monster for her, whether she wanted him to or not. The final blow came disguised as salvation. Gabriel had been drowning for 6 weeks when the lifeline appeared. A mysterious investor reached out through intermediaries, offering to buy Gabriel's struggling consulting firm for triple its current market value. The only condition was that Gabriel relocate to Seattle immediately to oversee the transition. "It's too good to be true," Gabriel told Natalia during one of their increasingly rare lunch meetings. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee. "But I don't have a choice anymore. I'm hemorrhaging money, and the vultures are circling." Alessandro watched from across their office as Natalia's face crumpled. She'd been holding herself together for weeks, maintaining her professional composure while her personal world collapsed around her. But this news, the possibility of Gabriel leaving the city permanently, finally broke through her carefully constructed walls. How long would you be gone? Natalia asked, her voice barely audible through the phone. The contract is for 2 years minimum, maybe longer if things go well. Gabriel's voice carried the weight of a man who'd lost everything and was grasping at the only rope thrown his way. Natalia, I know this isn't what we planned, but I need you to understand. I have nothing left here. My reputation is destroyed, my clients are gone, my credit is ruined. This is my only chance to start over. Alessandro felt a surge of dark satisfaction as he watched tears gather in Natalia's eyes. Every carefully orchestrated disaster had led to this moment. Gabriel Martinez would disappear from their lives, leaving Natalia vulnerable and alone, turning to the only constant in her world for comfort. "What about us?" Natalia whispered. The silence that followed stretched like a blade between them. Alessandro, to practically hear Gabriel's heart breaking through the phone, could imagine the man struggling with an impossible choice between love and survival. "Come with me," Gabriel said finally, desperation bleeding through his voice. "We could start fresh together, leave all this behind, and build something new." Alessandro's blood turned to ice. The possibility that Natalia might leave with Gabriel had never occurred to him. In all his careful planning, he'd assumed she would stay, would remain in the life he'd built around her. The thought of losing her completely made his vision blur with rage. "I can't," Natalia said, and Alessandro's world tilted back into focus. "My father is here, his doctors, his treatment. I can't just abandon everything." "Then what are we supposed to do?" Gabriel's voice cracked with exhaustion. "Long distance for 2 years? Maybe more? Natalia, I'm barely holding myself together as it is. I don't know if I'm strong enough to maintain a relationship across 3,000 miles while trying to rebuild my entire life." Alessandro watched Natalia press her mouth to her mouth, stifling a sob that made his chest constrict with something that might have been guilt if he'd allowed himself to feel it. Instead, he focused on the larger picture. Gabriel was weak, broken, ready to abandon the woman he claimed to love rather than fight for her. Alessandro would never be so weak. "I need time to think," Natalia said finally. "When do you have to decide?" "The investor wants an answer by Friday. The moving truck comes Monday if I say yes." 3 days. Alessandro had 3 days to ensure that Natalia made the right choice. 3 days to position himself as her anchor in the storm he'd created. That evening, as Natalia struggled to maintain her composure while organizing his files, Alessandro made his move. "You seem troubled, Miss Rossi. Is there anything I can help with?" She looked up at him with eyes red from crying, and for a moment Alessandro saw past her professional mask to the vulnerable woman beneath, the woman who was about to lose the man she loved because of choices Alessandro had forced upon them both. "It's nothing work-related, Mr. Torino, just personal matters." "Sometimes personal matters affect professional performance," he said gently. "If you need time off, or if there's anything I can do to help—" The kindness in his voice, genuine despite its calculated delivery, finally broke her remaining defenses. "The man I've been seeing, he's leaving the city. His business failed, and he has to start over somewhere else." Alessandro nodded sympathetically, playing the role of concerned employee, while inside, victory sang through his veins. "I'm sorry to hear that. These things are never easy." Natalia nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She had no idea she was crying over a man her boss had systematically destroyed. Gabriel left on a rainy Monday morning without saying goodbye. Natalia discovered his departure through a text message that arrived while she was brewing Alessandro's morning coffee. Her hands trembled as she read the words that shattered what remained of her carefully constructed world. "I'm sorry. I couldn't face seeing you cry again. The investor moved up the timeline. I had to leave today or lose the deal entirely. I love you, but I can't ask you to wait for someone who might never be whole again. You deserve better than what I can give you right now." The coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of porcelain and dark liquid. Alessandro looked up from his desk, concern flickering across his features as he took in her pale face and shaking hands. "Miss Rossi? What's happened?" "I'm sorry," she whispered, staring at the broken pieces scattered around her feet. "I'll clean this up immediately." But she didn't move. She stood frozen in the middle of their office, Gabriel's words echoing in her mind like a death knell. He was gone. The man she'd fallen in love with, the man she'd imagined building a future with, had vanished from her life like smoke. Alessandro rose from his chair with fluid grace, crossing to where she stood among the wreckage. "Leave it," he said softly. "I'll have someone take care of the mess." His kindness broke something inside her. For months, she'd been holding herself together through Gabriel's mounting disasters, offering strength she didn't possess, maintaining hope she didn't feel. But this final abandonment stripped away her last defenses. The tears came without warning, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. Alessandro stood beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a moment, she forgot he was her employer, forgot about professional boundaries and appropriate behavior. She turned toward him like a flower seeking sunlight, and Alessandro's arms opened to receive her. The embrace lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. Natalia felt the solid strength of his chest against her cheek, the careful way his hands settled on her back, the unexpected gentleness in his touch. When she pulled away, embarrassment flooding her cheeks with heat, she found Alessandro watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Torino. That was completely inappropriate." "You're in pain," he said simply. "There's nothing inappropriate about needing comfort." His understanding made her cry harder. For 3 years, Alessandro had been a constant in her life, demanding but fair, cold but never cruel. She'd never imagined he could be capable of such tenderness. "He left," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "Gabriel, his business failed and he took a job in Seattle. He said he couldn't ask me to wait for him." Alessandro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry. That must be very difficult." "I don't understand what happened to him," Natalia said, her voice breaking. 6 months ago, everything was perfect. His business was thriving, he was confident and happy. Then suddenly, everything started falling apart. It was like the universe decided to destroy him piece by piece. The universe. If only she knew how close to the truth she was. Alessandro felt a flicker of something that might have been guilt, but he pushed it aside. Gabriel's weakness had been his own downfall. A stronger man would have fought back, would have found a way to overcome the obstacles placed in his path. A stronger man would never have abandoned the woman he loved. "Sometimes life tests us in ways we don't expect," Alessandro said carefully. "The measure of a person isn't whether they face difficulties, but how they respond to them." Natalia nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue he offered her. "I keep thinking I should have done more to help him. Maybe if I'd been stronger, more supportive." "This is not your fault," Alessandro said firmly. "A man who truly loves you doesn't run away when things get difficult. He fights for what matters to him." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning Natalia couldn't quite grasp. She looked up at Alessandro, seeing him clearly, perhaps for the first time. The sharp intelligence in his dark eyes, the controlled power in his movements, the way he seemed to command the very air around him. Gabriel crumbled under pressure, but Alessandro Torino was the kind of man who created pressure, who bent the world to his will through sheer force of personality. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being so understanding. I promise this won't affect my work." Alessandro smiled, and something in that expression made her pulse quicken in a way she didn't understand. "Take the day off, Miss Rossi. Go home, rest, grieve if you need to. Tomorrow we'll start fresh." As she gathered her things and left the office, Natalia had no idea that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty,
and the man she'd worked beside for 3 years.
The truth came out on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Gabriel's disappearance. Natalia had been working late, trying to lose herself in spreadsheets and correspondence that couldn't fill the hollow ache in her chest. The office felt different without Gabriel's daily phone calls, without the secret smiles and whispered conversations that had once made her days bright with possibility. Alessandro had left hours ago for a business meeting, leaving her alone with the silence and her thoughts. She'd been organizing his files when she came across a folder that didn't belong with the others, a manila envelope tucked behind his quarterly reports, unmarked and slightly worn. Curiosity got the better of her grief. Inside, she found photographs, dozens of them. Gabriel sitting alone at their favorite cafe. Gabriel walking to his office building. Gabriel meeting with clients who would later abandon him. Each photo was time-stamped, creating a timeline that made her blood run cold. Beneath the photographs were documents, copies of anonymous complaints filed against Gabriel's business, records of fraudulent charges made to his credit cards, a contract with a private investigator signed in Alessandro's distinctive handwriting requesting comprehensive surveillance and strategic intervention. The final document was a bank transfer receipt, $2 million paid to a shell company in Seattle, the same amount Gabriel's mysterious investor had offered for his failing business. Natalia's hands trembled as the pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Gabriel's sudden run of bad luck hadn't been random. The mounting disasters that destroyed his life hadn't been coincidence. Alessandro had orchestrated everything. The office door opened behind her, and she heard his familiar footsteps crossing the marble floor. She didn't turn around, couldn't bear to look at him while the evidence of his betrayal lay scattered across his desk. "You're working late again," Alessandro said, his voice carrying that gentle concern that had comforted her for weeks. "I brought dinner from that Italian place you like." "How long?" she asked quietly, her voice barely audible. "How long what? How long have you been watching me, watching Gabriel, planning this?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Natalia finally turned to face him, holding up one of the photographs. Alessandro's face went pale as he saw what she'd discovered. "Natalia." "6 months," she read the timestamp on the photo. "You've been having Gabriel followed for 6 months. You documented his entire life, learned his weaknesses, identified his weaknesses." Alessandro's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "I can explain." "Explain what? How you systematically destroyed an innocent man's life? How you ruined his reputation, his business, his future?" She threw the photograph at him, her voice rising with each word. "How you made me watch the man I loved fall apart piece by piece while you comforted me." "He wasn't right for you," Alessandro said, his mask of gentle concern finally slipping. "He was weak. He crumbled under pressure that a real man would have overcome." "Pressure you created," Natalia shot to her feet, backing away from him. "You didn't test his strength, Alessandro. You destroyed him with resources he could never fight against. You used your power, your connections, your money to crush someone who never stood a chance." "I did it for you," he said desperately. "I love you, Natalia. I've loved you for 3 years, and I couldn't stand watching you waste yourself on someone who didn't deserve you." The confession she dreamed of hearing for so long now felt like poison in her ears. "You don't love me, Alessandro. You're obsessed with me. There's a difference." "That's not true. Love doesn't destroy, Alessandro. Love doesn't manipulate and scheme and ruin innocent lives. What you did to Gabriel, what you put me through watching him suffer, that wasn't love, that was possession." Alessandro stepped closer, and she saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. "Gabriel abandoned you. When things got difficult, he ran away rather than fight for what he claimed to love. I would never abandon you." "Because you're the one who made things difficult.
The words exploded from her with 3 years of suppressed emotion. You created an impossible situation and then judged him for not being able to handle it. You rigged the game and then called him weak for losing. I gave you what you needed, Alessandro replied, his voice hardening. A man who would fight for you, a man who would never leave you, a man who loves you enough to become a monster if that's what it takes. I never asked you to become a monster, Natalia whispered, tears streaming down her face. I never asked you to destroy someone I cared about. I never asked you to play God with our lives. She moved toward her desk, gathering her personal belongings with shaking hands. I'm leaving, tonight. I can't work for you anymore, and I can't be around you anymore. You can't leave, Alessandra said, panic creeping into his voice. Everything I did for us, for our future together. What future? Natalia laughed bitterly. You think I could ever be with someone who would do what you did? You think I could ever trust you after this? Every time I looked at you, I'd remember Gabriel's face when his world fell apart. I'd remember how you held me while I cried over the man you were destroying. She grabbed her purse and headed for the elevator, but Alessandro caught her arm. I love you, he said desperately. I've always loved you. Natalia looked up at him, and he saw something die in her eyes. I know you do, but your love is toxic, Alessandro. It poisons everything it touches. It turned you into someone I don't recognize, someone I'm afraid of. She pulled free from his grasp and stepped into the elevator. As the doors began to close, she spoke the words that would haunt him forever. I wanted you to stop me from loving someone else, not destroy my ability to love at all. But that's what you've done. You've broken something inside me that I don't think will ever heal. The doors closed with a soft chime, leaving Alessandro alone with the evidence of his crimes scattered across his desk. He had won nothing and lost everything that mattered. The woman he loved was gone, destroyed by his own obsession, and no amount of power or money could undo what he'd done. Alessandro Torino had finally gotten exactly what he deserved: an empire built on ashes and a heart full of regret that would last forever. In trying to make her love him, he had made it impossible for her to love anyone at all, including himself.